Hi everyone, I'm
Okay, wait,
Okay.
sorry, it's still going live. Now you go.
Hey everyone, I'm Toya Chinque. I'm the stream leader Data Cultures in the Science and Society Network and co-lead with Luke Heemsbergen of the Critical Digital Infrastructures and Interfaces Group. Today we have a presentation by our visiting scholar to the Science and Society Network, Ozma Burnot, and she's going to be speaking to us about facial recognition technology in Australia. We're joined with Chris O'Neill from Monash University, who will be the discussant after the presentation. We're going to record the presentation, and there will be the capacity for people to post comments, chat to YouTube, and if you wish, you can join us on Twitter using the Data Cultures Twitter feed. I'm going to share my screen, and thanks everyone for joining. I'll just change the slides as we go forward. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this hybrid seminar. We've made it work so far, so that's amazing. I think this is the first successful hybrid seminar that I've been able to attend. Usually they just sort of crash and burn, so congratulations. We're already off to a great start. My name is Asma, and I'm in that really interesting space in between having submitted my PhD in January, waiting to be conferred any day now, and have already started a postdoc at Charles University in National Security and Intelligence. Now, I also have the pleasure to be visiting SSN at Deakin as a visiting fellow, so thank you so much for having me here. Today, I'll be talking to you folks about a research project that involved 30 interviewees, which I've retitled now because this is a currently ongoing research project. So the working title now is Mapping the Facial Recognition Technologies Debate in Australia. Now, before I jump into the topic and the content of the presentation, I would like to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I usually live on the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal people, which are beautiful. I love those areas, and they're great. They're in Mianjin, currently known as Brisbane. And I would like to also acknowledge that the lands have never been ceded. Now, today I'll walk you through 4 topics. So one of them is going to be the project context, of course. I'll talk to you about the type of data that I'm looking at the moment, theoretical take, and the so what. Because I've taken this beautiful opportunity of the SSN Visiting Fellowship to really develop my work, I would like to cordially invite critique, ideas to the length of the presentation. Of course, I can't change my data at this point, but number 3 and 4, I'd love to have your input there if you have some ideas. Now, of course, we know that facial recognition in Australia right now is in a bit of a gray regulatory area. We're not sure how we're regulating it. We're not sure, if we have best practices for facial recognition. We're not really sure what those best practices are. But facial recognition in its many various forms, it's going ahead, it's continuing. Now, realizing the societal risk of that, the Australian Human Rights Commission had actually urged a temporary ban of facial recognition technologies, or FRTs, until they're regulated, which we've not seen play out. I'll talk to you folks first about, I'll tell you about the type of data that I've been able to collect by this project. So first of all, I looked at qualitative expert interviews, and 30 of them. So here I was defining an expert as somebody who had direct knowledge and experience of working with FRTs, as well as ability to influence policy. Now, if you add the numbers on the top right corner, you'll see that they don't quite add up to 30. And this is where things got a little bit interesting, but it was really great for me to see that I was able to recruit folks who had expertise both in tech, let's say, and in policy. So this is where you get that number that actually exceeds the actual amount of interviews I had. Now, the reason for that, this was a purposive sampling method. So I aimed to get a variety of voices. I didn't really want just the tech folks represented in this data set, or just, let's say, policy folks represented in this data set. More so, I embraced a systems approach, a multi-stakeholder approach to the data collection. And you will see that, of course, missing is the people who have facial recognition technology applied to it. But that would be a larger project and perhaps a future extension of the project. Now, I required interviewees to hold an affiliation with one or more of the following organizations, which would be the Commonwealth and state government agencies, independent institutes and think tanks, independent research organizations such as universities, or FRT development organizations, private or public, within Australia. And that analysis was quite straightforward, so I've embraced thematic analysis for this data set. And as all of you folks in this room and in the audience will understand, the very idea of best practices that I used to jumpstart the project was quickly taken away from the very limited tech understanding of best practices and towards a more embedded socio-technical understanding of how technologies are applied in social contexts and what are the effects of those technologies. So when I say best practices here in this project, unless I say tech best practices, we are approaching this critically here. So of course, in terms of FRT definitions, I won't go into the very techie definitions here. I just wanted to recognize that there's a wide variety of FRTs out there, all joined by one purpose of identifying facial data. And I come from a background of, my PhD was using surveillance studies theories. So I'm really taking that idea of a surveillance assemblage from Haggerty and Erickson and treating FRTs as technologies that are embedded or have the potential to be embedded within other surveillance technologies as well. So they're not just something that's out there and will never, ever be linked with a different technology, as we know. Now, one thing to mention is that the 30 interviews I talked to did not have particular concerns around one-to-one FRTs. So I'll cite one of the excerpts of that interview here, of a person saying, I don't have particular concerns around one-to-one as a human rights issue, because obviously that can be meaningfully tailored to be rights respecting. Of course, the technology has to be trained and developed. That's the ancillary question that comes before deployment. But at least in terms of deployment of one-to-one, there is a possibility of keeping all the data on the device, for example, and human rights impacts are more limited. And that view was reflected in other interviews as well, around human rights impact, but also around other impacts too. Now, overall, the one-to-one FRTs was the area that most interviewees agreed that as long as we're minding the tech best practices, meaning reliability, validity, data security, user data controls, it did not have a huge potential to introduce large social harms. Now, because of that, the one-to-one is not really discussed by the interviewees in this project. So what really concerned my respondents was uses that had potential of mass surveillance, so from anywhere between one to few to one to many, including security, law enforcement, cybersecurity, social services, efficiency in everyday life, and of course, sexy technology, which is technology that, you finish work on a Friday, You come back in on a Monday, and here you go. There's the sexy FRT waiting for you to clock in using your face. So there were a lot of examples of sexy technologies going around, and that was discussed as something quite vicarious and definitely not a best practice, neither in the technical nor the STS terms. So in terms of the data, and by data here, I really mean the themes, right? I'll start. Ooh,
Sorry.
hopefully.
Oh my God. Sorry.
No, we're good. Let me just
Just experimenting.
just experimenting. That's okay.
On the
Yeah.
security.
Yeah. I think it's working.
Yes,
All
I
good.
think
Thank
we're
you,
all good.
Karina. So let me first bore you before I present to you the more interesting findings of this research project. So first, yes, of course, there was lack of regulation. Look, really, the Privacy Act was the one thing where government agencies, independent researchers, and tech folk, they said, look, we look at the Privacy Act, we look at the privacy principles, and we have those precedents set by some legal cases, of course, as well, but also the Australian Information Commissioner to look at. So this is what we're really operationalizing. And of course, we know that the Australian Privacy Act covers Australian government agencies and organizations with an annual turnover of more than $3 million, but it does have a lot of gaps, and hopefully it's currently undergoing overhaul. So hopefully there is an opportunity for us to strengthen some of those considerations there. Now, it's in its current form, it is quite limited. And for example, when it comes to the Australian Information Commissioner, folks have critiqued that OAIC has mostly focused around notification and consent, issues that are widely critiqued in legal literature. And I'll give you an example. So when Clearview AI, the big tech company that scrapes image photos and recreates your looks over the years, which is very, very creepy, really high on the creepiness scale. So Commissioner Falk of OAIC found that Clearview AI breached the Australian Privacy Act by collecting Australian sensitive information without consent, collecting personal information by unfair means, and not taking reasonable steps to notify individuals of the collection of personal information, and therefore was not compliant with the APPs as well. Now, as with Kmart, Bunnings, and the good guys, we see that they said, oh no, but we had a poster that said that facial recognition is being run in this place. So we'll see how that plays out in terms of those cases that are currently ongoing. Now, of course, also number two of the boring stuff that the research confirmed rather than newly found themes was this techno-solutionist approach to social problems, right? So I come from a crim school, and of course we know that if crime happens, we need to talk about prevention measures, we need to talk about intervention measures. We don't just say, look, we're gonna put a bunch of FRTs in schools and make sure that youth offending in Queensland drops because we're constantly surveilling them. No, we want to, well, Queensland has said some problematic stuff, but anyhow, that's a different topic. But we really want to have a broader understanding of the social context in which the technology deployed. And when it came to defending the tech-based best practices and saying that, okay, if there was regulation, maybe further regulation, that would be okay. But we're currently all right with what we have. We're really aiming to, work with the Biometrics Institute, let's say, and adhere to their best practices. So this kind of worldview looked at the world as an efficiency problem that, of course, can be solved with nothing else but your favorite FRTs. And what was really interesting on the boring point number 3 was that, look, in the very beginning of an interview, I had a couple of lucky interview recruitment processes where I was able to onboard tech companies, have a really nice and open chat with them about the best practices, what they're doing, their views on regulation, etc. But then as the research progressed, and it was taking me, not an additional week, but an additional month to recruit a tech company, I really started understanding what some of my interviewees termed deliberately engineered lack of public debate, right? So even in a research context where all companies' names are confidential, not disclosed, their partners' names are not disclosed, and we adhere to really strict ethics procedures, it was really hard to recruit, right? One company got me to talk to them for, it was around 3 months, go through several meetings with their risk staff, and in the end, they ghosted me. It's really kind of worse than dating app ghosting, because this is linked to my KPI, so I was not happy. So there's definitely some avoidance tactics that companies are employing there. And, you can come out and say that you have a zero bias something, but, if you're not engaging with the people on which you are going to be deploying this technology, I'm not sure how you're arriving at that conclusion, right? So that added a little bit of my suspicion towards the tech. I started with a very positive note, but ended up on not a very positive note. Now, in terms of the interesting stuff, right? So some of the new findings that this research project has presented and has really got me thinking about FRT regulation. So first of all was that all of the 30 interviewees agreed that in its current state, FRTs do have the potential to cause social harms in Australia, right? So, by the way, I should have said this is Australia only, right? Because we know about the US, this is Australia only. So it was really interesting to see that even the tech folks who were really certain that their company was doing a good job and taking a lot of protections around user data and whatnot, even they said, oh, look, we are doing this, but the other companies are not, right? So we know that that's happening. And they were able to confirm that, yes, there could be potential to data leaks, there could be potential to unjust practices when FRTs are deployed. So I thought that was quite an interesting finding. And now there was also this perception that on number 2, that if regulated correctly, if regulated well, FRTs could be both rights enabling and rights harming technologies. And I'll talk a little bit more about the regulation spectrum that I called. I have an arrow in there. It's such an exciting slide coming up. Yeah, there was this idea that, we have a lot of work to do in terms of regulation, but we could potentially deploy FRTs in a positive way. Not everybody agreed with that, but that was quite a common, that was the majority of the participants who did. Now, at the same time, in terms of what sort of bad things might happen when FRTs are deployed, there was a lot of difficulty in articulating that. A particular quote that really struck me and that I will read out for you folks here today came from a person who has more than 20 years of experience in the field in working with these technologies, creating them, working towards their regulation as well, with only tech regulation. But this person said, usually those stakeholders, those end users who get impacted, they don't have the full picture. Therefore, it is difficult to complain or prove the point that, hey, look, there's systematic discrimination going on against this particular cohort of people. And an interesting and funny example is that whenever I pass through the Australian border with my family, usually they get through the automated gates and I get stopped. So to me, I kind of understand that because I know all of those things that are happening behind it. And I'm a male, I'm in this age, and they are kids, so they get a really different score. But could it be considered to be discrimination, or is it not really broad enough, right? So a person with 20 years of experience really struggled to articulate those thoughts. An example of, yes, did border security discrimination, right? It was not really sure about how to call it. So he noted that to call it out, I really don't know how to do that and what the problem is. So it was really quite discouraging to hear this interviewee talk about that. And of course, as we know, there are a few pathways for reporting harms like this. Now, the theoretical take, and this is where I'll ask for as much engagement with you amazing scholars as possible. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on these particular thoughts. So one of the things that I wanted to share, and this is a finding we have. So the arrow is meant to signify a move from people who were upset with regulation to the move with a cluster of opinions, let's call them cluster of opinions of people who were upset with the tech-based best practices, and a cluster of opinions of respondents who were upset with both the regulation and the tech stuff. Okay? Let me explain. So as I noted here in the point number 2, there was a majority of folks thought that FRT could be rights enabling and both a rights harming technology. And the precondition for that was point number 1, that in Australia we should have comprehensive regulation that would include privacy regulation, human rights, consumer law, data security laws, and even a risk-based laws, right? And this is something that we also talked about in the civic workshop yesterday, which in the context of the European Union, that there's a move towards having more comprehensive regulation. Now, a commentary around that was, I'm quoting here again, that it's not even just the tech regulation, it's also general human rights obligations in Australia. Australia really stands out alone in that respect among liberal democracies as not having any enforceable rights regime. So that extended in different interviews, didn't stop at the human rights. Folks thought, look, we need really a collection of different comprehensive laws and regulations that would be there. Because in 5 years, we know there's going to be the next sexy technology that's going to come around. So even let's say if Ed Santos model law goes through and does regulate FRTs, we're going to be left at square one without this type of regulation. Right? And I perceive this idea as a provocation. It's saying, yes, we can have that, but we need 10 different laws that need to be passed in Australia at the federal level for us to have that. So, it's a possibility, but also in realistic terms, it's something that's quite difficult to reach. Right? Now, the folks who were upset or disappointed with the tech practices, they talked about the different tech things that are quite difficult to wrap their heads around. So, for example, FRTs are highly outsourced and they're highly fragmented when it comes to putting one technology together in terms of hardware and software. One tech company shared that they were going through X-raying parts of hardware for their FRT and as part of their quality assurance process. And one of the plastics actually contained a surveillance device in a plastic mold imported from China. And look, I study China. I'm not saying that China necessarily does that all the time, but I'm just saying that this could happen from in hardware, this could happen in software, and the vetting processes are really quite complicated, right? To start with, you need to have an X-ray machine for your QA process, and that's just the plastic, the outside of the FRT. In terms of other best practices, they were also looking at, let's say, the privacy assessment and talking to your employees about the tech being logged, which is even the tech-based best practices, there were concerns that, tech companies were not sure where the cutoff line was. Now, the third group of people, they said, look, this is all well and good. And they fully leaned into the provocation of saying FRT can be quite beneficial if regulated well. But they said, look, it's probably going to be really quite difficult to achieve that. Because first of all, and I will quote another interviewee here, bureaucratic steps still do not address the underlying injustices at the heart of the technology and often gloss over problems with its reliability and functionality. We support a moratorium, and that is not to say that we do not support regulation, because there are real downsides in having a regulatory-free environment, but also we think there are times at which regulation can be deployed to prohibit its use. And they cited, let's say, the deliberately engineered lack of public debate, lack of engagement by the government with citizen stakeholders, covert information capitalism and extractivism in the training data sets, and let's say the fact that the model law that's proposed bypasses law enforcement. I could talk a little bit more about this, but in the interest of time, let me move on. Now, I will give you an example that hopefully wraps a lot of these, the boring stuff and the interesting stuff, as I've called it, of the data findings into one, which was the question around racial bias and gender bias in data sets, and that was one of the basic things one of the basic concerns that we have around FRTs is that we have examples, mostly from the US, that when people of color are being seen by FRTs, it's not necessarily a good experience. FRTs are not necessarily good at recognizing their faces. And of course, now companies are saying, oh, that was that technology, we have this technology, look, we've been able to remove the bias and whatnot. But, we clearly know FRTs were known to recognize faces of white dudes pretty well, but then the faces of Black women in particular were really hard to recognize. In this particularly harrowing example, which you might be familiar with, the Facebook's FRT system was recognizing some Black women as gorillas on social media posts, which was absolutely a hideous and just really embarrassing aspect of deploying FRT without proper testing, right? So of course, I had to ask my interviewees, hey, look, you've done the testing in the US, let's say, now in Australia, this is a multicultural society. What about, we have a lot of embedded issues with racism as the fabric of the Australian society almost, as part of Australia. So what about the Indigenous peoples here? Yeah, are you sure that your FRT system is good with recognizing Indigenous faces? And it took me 3 interviews to understand this, but I got there. What I know is that this data is not available. So we actually don't know how FRTs perform on Indigenous faces. And of course, tech companies have been quite active in saying, oh, we should have this data set, we should be able to access this data set. There's, of course, huge concerns around obtaining a data set like that. And even larger concerns exist around the social context of this request, right? We know that there's over-criminalization of Indigenous peoples in the whole of Australia when it comes to homicide rates, when it comes to imprisonment rates. It's just hard across the whole criminal justice system. So if you find a technical solution to a technical problem, right? Let's say we don't know how FRT performs on Indigenous faces of Indigenous Australians. And that allows you to find a technical solution. Once you find a technical solution, because we know that technical solutionism is this big idea that we're using to sell FRTs, we're then able to deploy it, right? So obviously we shouldn't give the data of Indigenous people's faces before, at least before we have all of that comprehensive regulation. Because yes, we don't know, and that's probably a good thing at this point, right? For us not to know, because we're obviously cannot handle this technology at the moment. Now, with the so what, moving on to the so what of the research project, and this is where I'll probably slightly over time. Sorry about that, folks. I'll just bring this to a close with a quote from one of the interviewees, and a really beautiful quote from a recently published book called Ethics of Virtue. If I got the title right, I'm in my presentation buzz moment. So if I got that wrong, somebody correct me. So these things are happening as fast as always, really fast as always, and without very much public discussion, without enough research, independent research, looking at how these things are actually operating. And before we know it, it's too late, and FRTs are absolutely entrenched. And so in this book, Professor Angela Davey has a chapter in which she contributes this beautiful idea. And look, she's using an example of AI and an example of how local resistance can be quite effective. I dare you as a mental exercise to replace the AI acronym with FRT, and just imagine that I'm saying that as FRT. These everyday encounters with FRT and its politics bring AI ethics back from distant policymakers and political and corporate elites to individuals and communities, recognizing their and our agency in negotiating and resisting technology applications. These contestations and resistances can provoke action and change to curb uses of AI on a grounded local level compared to the lofty and at times elitist AI ethics initiatives, which often lag behind and tend not to prohibit or severely restrict certain AI uses and applications. So by now you will have understood that, yes, I did use best practices to jumpstart my project, and I've gone 180 degrees and ended with Angela Daly's quote in wrapping up this project. And really, as a next step, I would like to propose something where, this is another area where I would like to seek your consultation. In introducing a project, this is a prototype of a website that I have built called the Facial Recognition Hans Register in Australia. So really a place where folks would have tools to understand what is facial recognition Han, what sort of words you might be able to use to articulate it, and then to report a harm as it occurs. Some of the questions I have is, of course, FRTs, such a wide range of different technologies. Do we organize data like this across verticals such as health, social services, public services, and also how do you evaluate the data of consents coming in and their validity? So these are some questions that I'm currently considering, and I do invite the discussion. I know, Chris, you had some questions around that. In the meantime, I'll leave my email here in case somebody wanted to reach out.
Thanks, Osma. Osma, such an interesting topic. We're going to invite Chris and Neil and literally move right in so
Sure.
that with some questions. No, please.
I'm just going to close the screen share so that everyone can see the camera.
Oh, I see.
Because otherwise everyone just sees the screen. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Just pretend like you're talking.
You're not being
No.
recognized. No, I know.
On the Zoom, it's much further. On the stream, it's much further away.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
This is the Zoom.
It's less confronting.
Yeah,
on
there's
the-
a
You can
different
look into
level.
my eyes and we just have a chat.
We're not tracking you.
Yeah.
talk to himself.
There's a secret little FRT in the.
Good. Okay. It's like sort of Brechtian alienation effect going on. Very aware of giving a response right now. Yes. So, I mean, first of all, thank you so much, Asma, for that
There you
Oh,
go.
there you
That
go.
would be.
Oh,
that's much better.
That's much better.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Okay. So first of all, yes. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It's been such it's a fantastic project. And thank you as well, Deacon SSN for offering the opportunity to be here and to offer some thoughts in response. A little bit about me. So my name's Chris O'Neill. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow based at Monash University. I'm a member of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society. Rolls trippingly off the tongue, you know. But I'm also involved in a discovery project led by Mark Andreevich at Monash University. So it's between Monash and ANU. So me, Mark, Neil Selwyn, Shin Gu at Monash, and also Gavin Smith and Pat O'Malley at ANU. Like Hasbro, we've been looking at the sort of development of facial recognition technologies, especially in Australia. This kind of the sort of synthetic kind of work that Els was doing is so crucial, I think. This is such a timely project because there's been really, immense investment in the sort of technical infrastructure of FRTs in Australia over the last decade plus, both in commercial and sort of political, federal and state sort of political infrastructures. But also, I mean, sort of the question of a centralized mode of identification in Australia is a very long-standing project. Even going back to the 80s, the Hawke government tried to bring in the Australia ID, would have been a national identification card. That was, immensely controversial project. And interestingly, it was never properly resolved. It didn't come through, but it was only really defeated on a kind of technicality. There was the actual substantive legal or ethical or moral justification for a mode of national identification was never really settled. The political impetus for it has never really gone away. And apparently, so there was a very interesting story in the Saturday paper just a month and a half ago, I think. Apparently, Prime Minister Albanese announced to business leaders, sort of Chamber of Commerce kind of dinner that he's planning to bring in a formal proposal for a biometric enabled national digital ID card, probably sometime this year, or sometime very soon anyway. For some reason, I don't know, this story itself didn't really get picked up either. I mean, it's pretty interesting, I think. Albanese thinks, he's explicitly saying in the speech that he thinks he'll be able to bring this in without the controversy that dogged the Hawke government's Australia card in the 80s. So it's very much on the political agenda, but as I was pointing out, there's been a more or less deliberate kind of avoidance of publicly airing, publicly discussing these, what would be a really massive sort of shift in the infrastructure of identity within Australian state and civil society. And I think the kind of general public's understanding of both the technical and also the kind of, I guess, sort of social significance of this kind of shift is very, very low. And so, the kinds of, as I was saying, this sort of synthetic work, drawing upon this sort of multi-stakeholder approach, and also the question of public engagement is like couldn't be any more timely. You were mentioning before the Biometrics Institute, and I think the Biometrics Institute is the only sort of, I mean, it's not really a public forum. It's a sort of quasi-public forum. It's the closest thing that we have to a public forum for the discussion of these sort of issues. Biometrics Institute is a very interesting organization. It was actually set up in Australia very shortly prior to September 11 attacks, which is turns out pretty opportune time to set up a industry lobby around for the biometrics industry. It's set up in Canberra, but now has offices in London and Washington. It's become kind of the de facto international sort of, well, how does it describe itself? A global hub for business, government, and academia to collaborate and promote responsible and ethical biometrics. That's the way it sort of describes itself. And our group, I think we're members actually of the Institute. We've attended a few of their conferences. And they're very good, actually. They have a wide view of a wide range of respondents that they invite to discuss biometrics, social issues, and so forth. Including very sort of vociferous critiques sometimes of the use of biometrics itself. But fundamentally, it's an industry hub. It's sort of organized around industry interests. And so there's a certain sort of, the actual kind of space for kind of really critical social engagement with biometrics and facial recognition is kind of delimited. The big project they've had recently, they feel like facial recognition, particularly in America and Europe, has been unfairly criticized by a public that doesn't understand how it really works, et cetera, et cetera. One of their big projects was to develop what they called a good news, good news stories about, how biometrics might, I suppose, be a rights enabling technology. But I think something like a harms register is a really crucial sort of counterbalance or counterweight to something like that. Something that occurred to me during Asma's presentation as well, though, is as a sort of adjunct, I think, to the question of the harms register, and maybe to the question of a sort of rights-based approach, which I completely agree is crucial. Something I think that's really worth paying attention to, though, is precisely coming out of the groups like the Biometrics Institute, but sort of the industry more broadly, is the kinds of legitimating discourses, making the case for why we need facial recognition. As I said, I think this is going to be a big year. This next 12 months, I think, will be when the actual case is sort of explicitly made. And I think it's sort of, incumbent upon us as researchers critically engaged with these sort of questions to be critically evaluating the way these cases are made. Sometimes the case is very straightforward. I mean, the big one is sort of convenience, right? Frictionlessness is sort of a kind of buzz term, I suppose, that gets used. Being able to pay with your face or being able to move smoothly through customs at the airport. These are kind of obvious sort of conveniences that can be used to sell the kind of the benefit of facial recognition. But it's when the sort of harms that get brought up, to sort of question the deployment of facial recognition, that sort of other forms of legitimation get sort of discussed. And there's a few figures that we've noticed in our own research and I think we're probably talking to some of the same people, in the industry. And some of the, they're sort of more or less cognizant, I suppose, of relative ethical questions around these things and social and political questions. A big one that we found is the sort of figure of the. Oh, sorry.
Maybe just wrap up next couple.
Sure.
So
yeah.
a bit of Q&A.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think so. there's basically just a few that we'd noticed. I think a big one in particular is the question of the child, and the question of the protection of children, the way that the innocence of children gets evoked. That's kind of, I don't know, becomes kind of all encompassing. I don't know. Literally, we've raised this with some people, aren't you worried about, say, racial discrimination and so forth? And like, yeah. But at the end of the day, if your child gets abducted and we can turn face recognition on, wouldn't you want to do it? The way children, it gets kind of thrown around very kind of helter-skelter, I suppose. That's a kind of pretty volatile sort of discourse. The other big one, of course, is political issue around sort of fraud and identity theft. At the moment, I think that's going to be like a big way that that the case is made for facial recognition this year. Behind that is sort of the question of trauma. The use of facial recognition to sort of allay or automate the sort of experience of trauma, because this is also coming in, for example, in the way facial recognition is being used in disaster response. During the bushfires, for example, elements of the Privacy Act that would have, limited the use of facial recognition were suspended. So they were sort of running the tests on using facial recognition to identify people whose identifying documents were destroyed and so forth. And the way that this was justified was it would avoid people having to tell their sort of re-traumatizing stories, exactly, right? So there's a whole welter of different kinds of ways that these sort of legitimizing discourses become invoked. These are very difficult. Some of these are kind of, they're hard to argue with, right? You can't really be pro-child abduction as a way of kind of questioning the legitimacy of facial recognition. But this is the thing I wonder about broadly. Like, how do we, on the one hand, yes, I think we do need to sort of raise a register of harms. But on the other hand, how do we kind of, going beyond that sort of narrow, or not even narrow, but, the sort of question of errors and so forth, how do we sort of encourage a kind of broader discussion over like legitimate or illegitimate social uses and use cases more broadly? I think that's very difficult, and very difficult to do in a way that doesn't just sort of reinforce industry's own claims to necessity, basically. So that would be, I don't know, that's my sort of, challenge or response. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and the key there for me at the moment, and I'm open to discussion here, is to really not define social harms too narrowly, and really allow for the possibility for folks to submit all kinds of accounts around FRT. And this is going to be a lot of qualitative analytic work, of course. But in my view, it doesn't necessarily have to directly link with the rights discourse. There can be a log of different things, and it can just be structured into, let's say, legal cases or community-based cases, a structure that would allow different kind of cases and different examples to be reported. And then, let's say somebody wants, 10 validated sources in reviewing a case, and a legal transcript, they would be able to find that there. But if somebody wants to explore more broadly those questions that you're asking, you're posing as a challenge to myself, they would have an opportunity to look at the cases that have not gone through legal processes, the cases where people felt uncomfortable or felt that, look, I don't have the words to describe it or describe why I was uncomfortable, but this happened to me and I wanted to talk about it. So perhaps that could be a solution. It does raise a question of what sort of input the register would allow. Would it just be an email? Would it require some sort of an account, photos, a newspaper clipping, if you may? So that's a question that I don't have an answer to yet.
No, that's all right. I mean, no, I think that's great. 'Cause it's a question of that, almost like the texture of like the sort of these kind of everyday contingent uses, which you're right. We have, you know.
I like that, the texture of everyday contingent uses. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah, here you go.
Better.
Put it right up there.
Please. Because you're right. There's just so little on this. I mean, it's a huge project, and I don't know. We need a lot more data, really.
Yeah, we
even
do.
just to begin with, you know.
We do. We really don't know what's going on out there after deployment.
Exactly. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Chris, sorry.
I have questions from the group. Briefly, Luke.
I do, but I don't want to. Sorry, I either have 12, but you know. Thank you very much, both of you, for that enlightening talk, or maybe geometrically enlightening talk. The Angela's quote about, you know, until FRT, I think it was her, until FRT are already entrenched. I thought, you know, until AI is already entrenched. But I thought the FRT one was really interesting, because, you know, we've I guess my question to you is two parts. You know, where do you see a line for these types of technologies in terms of the concerns you're talking about, and how they're, sorry, I should say where they're deployed, where we start to have thinking about the things you're talking through in terms of regulation, in terms of moratoriums, in terms of the rest of it. And the reason I ask that is that, you know, you could argue that FRTs already are entrenched, and everyone has at least one, right, in Australia, that literally uses FRT as an interface. One, to just, my phone's now open, but two, to interact with my phone in different ways. You know, I'm doing a project on literally how my kids interact with facial recognition technology, how they play with it. It's play for them, right? So these technologies, in terms of, you know, abstracting a lot of national security context, are entrenched, and I don't know how to get out of that. Yeah, as a parent, or otherwise. So I guess that the first question is, you know, when we're thinking about the rights-based perspective, or even, you know, I was speaking yesterday about, you know, do we wait for the harms to show themselves and then let the market understand what that looks like, so that we can, you know, where do you see, do you see a need to focus on the texture of everyday use in our phones, or is it the other end, the national security side, of going through the biometrics, or having this centralized, you know, equation? Where do you see the priority, as question number one, if that makes sense to the question. And then question number two, I mean, just, you know, speaking through the discourses around rights enabling for FRTs, I thought that was really interesting. And I because I wonder what those are, if not just solutionism, you know, the answer in search for problem type thing. So I wonder, talking about data doubles, you know, if we have our harms registry, is there like a dark site that you would also put together where people could witness their rights, you know, being grown, right, by these technologies, or just as a thought exercise, that might be really interesting, because maybe there is, maybe it's solutionism, you know, laid bare, and that's a very empty space, and that in itself speaks volumes. But I just thought, as a kind of sister website, if you will, or sister witnessing, that might be really interesting to show that disparity. So
Makes me think of Osma's point in the talk, and she gives the example of sometimes we don't know when we're stopped by, you know, the friction is there because we're stopped. Could be at a border, for example. But it, for me, then makes me think of examples when companies are able to use, you know, cheaper and cheaper facial recognition technologies to advance their business. So I think of an example: an entertainment company was running an event and had litigation, and so was able to stop anyone that was working for the legal company. So anyone that was a family member or working for that company, if they turn up to an entertainment event, no, sorry, you can't come in. They would be quite well aware of why they couldn't come in, probably.
Yeah.
But what examples are there? Do we even know? So, for example, I go for a loan. No, you can't have it because we know X, Y, and Z about you. But this other person can get brilliant products because we know X about them.
Sorry, I do want to hear your answer. That's a really interesting interpretation of rights, because whose rights are we talking about, right? The companies to say they actually don't want these people here, or the people who feel discriminated against. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah. No, that's great, and I love the response too. And I think these are great questions to think about. I could probably answer the first question. The second question is something for me personally to think about and delve a little bit deeper as I look through the data again. In terms of priority, because of my criminological training, I'm not that great in sociological thinking. So it's the texture of everyday contested uses. I definitely have to leave it to you folks, to Mark's team. I saw it yesterday. You do amazing work. It was great. That would probably, in terms of my training, would not be the strength. And also, I think it's important to do work that's complementary, because this area of research is so broad, and we're really trying to understand as much as possible about this area of research. And it's just really important that we attack it from different angles. So I think for me, yes, the priority would be that social harms register in terms of understanding, because from these interviews, I understand that these harms are already occurring. It's just that we don't know about them. We've not logged them, right? And was that a real example? That was, here you go.
Yeah.
Somebody read a conversation article of mine and emailed me this huge concern that they had around a small rural town in Queensland, and how FRT was being deployed there, and how just disproportional that was, right? So I think that there's scope to discover the harms that are already happening on the ground, and just really have a better
might help
look at
answer the question in some ways, right? It, like very, very crassly, or 70% of the harms that are coming into it at borders, or 70% of Madison Square Gardens, because you can't go see the, like it would be really interesting. So it's a great project.
I was just thinking about the harms registry, and you mentioned the criminology around it, but what does it mean for example, could he throw up where it might be a matter for Commonwealth legislation versus legislation for the states or territories? Because I understand that we've got 10 principles for privacy, but our legislation is different across Australia. So we've got Commonwealth privacy legislation, but then it's differently applied in states and territories. Could some of these stories speak to how that might be more cohesive? Calling for what you're saying is something that is more holistically applied, because it's not just local, but it is something that's national, but it's also international. So if, for example, and some of you know in the Four Corners special last night, a woman is having deepfakes made about her and pornography made, she makes a complaint to her ombudsman and privacy commissioner or to cybersecurity, and they say, well, yes, we can have X, Y, and Z, but the person is no longer living in Australia. How do we then solve that problem, for example? So we get stories. How do we apply a solution?
Yeah, that's great.
Maybe, sorry to cut it short, but maybe last thoughts from you, Osma, and then we will whisk everyone away to our impending futures. It's called lunch.
Here comes the future.
Here comes the future. That's a great question, and also something I've taken note of, and we'll be giving it a lot more thought after this. With at the moment, one understanding that I've come out of doing this project with was that a lot of these harms occur in the context of law enforcement, and I'm European, and in Europe we tend to, not in all places, but in quite a few places, we tend to have a bit more checks and balances for law enforcement. So we like to say, look, let's sit down, let's talk about this new tech that you had. How many cases were you able to crack with it? Was it useful for you? Okay, we spent a lot of money. Was that a useful investment, or should we not have done that? And we're okay with having conversations like that. And these are conversations around, evaluations of the deployment of such technologies that I don't necessarily see happening in Australia. And it would be really interesting to see how law enforcement, for example, is looking at, look, we deployed Clearview AI. You complained, but before that, it also didn't work for us, or just having a bit more of a critical evaluation of that. So that would be an interesting starting point, but I recognize that there's broader implications that extend beyond that.
So we've got a question from our online group. This is from Rita, I believe. Rita, will Australia introduce social credit systems after creating a biometric ID system similar to that in China? And I'm thinking something that India's wanting to bring in as well. Do you have thoughts very briefly on that?
A couple of weeks I was asked about is Australia introducing a social credit system? I don't think so. Is Australia? No. I don't think that's currently happening. Yes, but there was a video that circulated around the Sydney Mardi Gras on TikTok that was saying that, look, you will be ranked so face will be grabbed, you'll be ranked, and then the police will have a different score of each participant to Sydney Mardi Gras. So there's no evidence of that, by the way. We could not find evidence of that. So the fact-checking people online published and said, look, there's currently no evidence of that. So that would be my response. But FRTs do have the capability to link to other surveillance technologies. So that is definitely a concern in that respect.
Obviously in government sector, as you're saying, but then also in the private sector, and then assuming you make over 1 million or 3 million, then you need to have a policy for your own company. But if you don't, no policy.
Yeah, that's right.
You've got cheap FRT and installed cameras, etc. Wow, it's a brilliant conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Look, we're at time. We can carry this over lunch, but would you join me in thanking again both Alberta and Christopher?
Recording's off. We can all breathe again. So they tell us that leaving stuff here is like more safe than less safe. I never had anything taken, but we'll go downstairs to the lobby, and then you go down the escalator. And there's a place called Mr. Collins that looks like a pizza place, and it is. And there's a table for us there. Follow me if you will, because we're a little late.
And for our guests, if you like a comfort zone, straight down the end of the corridor. It's just slightly to the right, and same just downstairs.
Yeah, maybe I'll just barge ahead so I can keep this restaurant happy with this. So the first time I cancel them, and everyone else can go on the left.
Oh, well done. Sorry, I don't want to too long.